Okay, perfect. So welcome everybody, and thank you for coming to our session. It's an afternoon session, so I know everybody's like coming in right before we probably head out for the rest of the day. But I appreciate you taking the time just to come and join us. And as we talk a little bit about the Japanese experience in Virginia, both during an internment and a little bit beforehand as well. And I'm going to go ahead and introduce our speaker. So I'm very excited because we have with us Emma Ito. So Emma Ito is currently the Director of Education at Virginia Humanities, the State Humanities Council headquartered in Charlottesville at the University of Virginia. She worked previously at the Library of Virginia, which, of course, as a librarian, we love. And she aided in coordination and implementation of educational programs and outreach for students, teachers, and the public, with a particular focus on Asian, Pacific Islander, Daisy American projects. So Emma, I am going to throw it over to you and let you unmute and take it away.
Yay! Thank you, Carrie. Hi, everyone. It's great to see you guys. Thank you guys for being here today. And please feel free to ask questions throughout. I'll try to keep an eye on the chat too. So I'm gonna share my screen. Probably should have tested this earlier. Sorry, Carrie. Okay, can you guys see this?
Yep, you are good.
Cool. Hang on, let me make sure it's all big. Okay, so I'm gonna be looking at my other computer screen. So if you see me not looking, it's not because I'm not paying attention, it's because I'm looking at my other screen. And the way that I'm gonna do this is actually, I'm gonna start a lot earlier than maybe you guys thought I was. And part of that is because I wanna build some of the context of kind of anti-Asian sentiment and anti-Japanese sentiment before we even get to Japanese American incarceration. And I also really enjoy, I want to talk about Jim Crow. And so this whole presentation has to do with Asian Americans and Japanese Americans in Virginia specifically. And Virginia is a very interesting place, as we know, for a lot of different reasons. And so that's why I wanted to kind of back up first and build some of this history. So oftentimes we a lot of people think of Asian Americans and Pacific Islanders as being newer immigrants. And while there are a lot of new communities and new immigrants, there are actually Asian immigrants here in Virginia very, very early. This is actually an indenture of 2 boys from China and a boy from India from 1860 that was found at the Library of Virginia. So we also see some larger dates here on the right when Filipinos started arriving in the United States, Chinese immigrants started coming to the United States, Japanese immigrants coming to Hawaii, and as I mentioned, Asian Americans or Asian immigrants here in Virginia very early. Like I said, I'm starting a lot earlier than maybe you guys thought, so sorry about that. Another piece that's often forgotten is that there actually were Asian and Pacific Islanders in the Civil War. And this is actually a handbook that the National Park Services released. But for example, there were some soldiers like Thomas, who was in the Pennsylvania Emergency Militia during the battles of Gettysburg. He was someone who was captured and went through Petersburg and through Richmond and was interned at Belle Isle during the Civil War. And again, I'm not going super deep into some of this stuff, but I just think it's really interesting stories that I didn't know for a really long time. And then to start kind of building some of this historical content. So these are some larger dates. So for example, in 1790, as many of us know, the Naturalization Act limited naturalized citizens to free white persons. And obviously that gets interpreted in a lot of different ways. And what does that mean for Asian Americans and Asian immigrants? We have the Chinese Exclusion Act that a lot of people, I think, have been learning more and more about from 1882 to 1943. And that specifically excluded Chinese immigrants from coming here. We also have the US annexation of Hawaii, which was an illegal joint resolution to overthrow the Kingdom of Hawaii. And then we have something called the Wong Kim Ark versus United States Supreme Court case in 1898. And that whole court case, I'm not going to super go into it, but basically is really, really important as far as defining citizenship, because it confirmed and guaranteed US birthright citizenship of an American-born child of Chinese parents. And here on the right actually is a really interesting story that talks about a Richmond-born Chinese boy, Charles William Sing, in, I'm trying to remember what year, 1908, so really early. There was actually a pretty large Chinese community in Richmond, and this boy, his parents were running around basically trying to prove that their son Charles was born here in America so that he would have that birthright citizenship. And there's actually an inspector, I have a whole article on it that, and I'll have links at the end that you can read about, but basically this inspector was going all throughout Richmond trying to confirm that this boy was born in the United States. And it's really interesting too, because not only was Charles Sing Chinese American, but he was second gen technically, which meant that his mother was actually referenced as a Chinese woman, but she was born in San Francisco. But we already start to see this like really deep questioning, both nationally and in Virginia, of like Asian Americans and Asian identity being questioned, basically. And I love Larry. What a great question. So Larry just said, did the court cases with Ozawa and Thin change the citizen status of US born Asian Americans? And I am actually going to mention Ozawa and Thin. It didn't change the citizen status of US born Asian Americans. So if you're born in Asia, born in America, you could use that Wong Kim Ark birthright citizenship, but it affected those who immigrated here. So I will talk a little bit about that. That's a great question, by the way. So I'm just like fast forwarding a little bit to kind of set the stage of, there were Japanese immigrants that came to Virginia before World War II. And there were a lot of students as early as 1888 at schools like Roanoke College, Randolph-Macon, UVA, University of Richmond, Hampton-Sydney, and Union Theological Seminary. And there are also a lot of educators that came from Japan to speak at universities in Virginia. There were also Japanese dignitaries that would come and visit the Homestead, which is a high-end luxury resort in Hot Springs, Virginia. Now tuck that away because I'm gonna revisit that after World War II. But you know, this is just a really interesting story, for example, of a student who was at Randolph-Macon. His name is Sangi Ogawa. And this is, I'm going chronologically. So this is actually in 1904 and 1905. And it's really, his story is fascinating. I hope someone maybe at some point does more research about him, because basically he was really interested in Christianity and he studied it in Kobe, Japan. And so that's why he ended up coming here, which anyone that comes from Japan and Virginia, you have to like think about how far that was, right? Like early 1900s, like how did they even get here? That would take so long. It takes long now, right? It's like a 12-hour flight. So like thinking about back then, people traveling here, I always think their stories are so interesting. So for example, for Sangi, he was a son of a Japanese gentleman of wealth and high standing. And his parents, his dad was Buddhist and super disapproved of his interest in Christianity. So he basically didn't support his son. And so while Ogawa was here in Virginia, he basically supported himself by selling Bibles in parts of West Virginia and Maryland, chopping wood and working as a janitor, which is so interesting to me when you think of how few Asian American immigrants or Asian immigrants, period, let alone Japanese immigrants, were here in Virginia. And can you imagine like a young Japanese man selling Bibles, right? Like at door to door in West Virginia. So his story is just very interesting. And basically he supported himself. And unfortunately, he contracted typhoid fever while he was visiting and preaching in Matthews County in Virginia, and actually died in Dixie Hospital in Hampton. And he was only 22 years old. And it's even more sad because it was mentioned that once he, like upon hearing his success as a student in America, his parents basically had just reconciled with him and were like excited for him to come home. So it's like kind of a sad story. And actually they had trouble getting his remains back. And reportedly his remains were stolen in London. So when this was relayed to the Randolph-Macon faculty and students, all the friends that he had made, people were really upset and they were really sad. And so they pushed for the idea of an endowment for him. And so in June 1905, Randolph-Macon actually unveiled a bronze tablet in their college chapel dedicated to this student. And the tablet, I don't think it's in the chapel anymore, but the tablet is still there at Randolph-Macon. We also have other folks that were visiting Virginia for other reasons. This is Tokukuchiro Abe, who came from the upper echelons of Japanese society, and in March 1906 was basically asked by the Japanese government to research tobacco. And so he came and settled on the East Broadsheet in Church Hill in Richmond, Virginia, which Church Hill in Richmond, Virginia is a historically Black neighborhood. So it's interesting when you start thinking of these Jim Crow, like where would other people fit in to a society that typically, for many reasons that I'll get into, had been separated between white and Black. And so he actually he also got typhoid fever when he was here, but his body couldn't be returned home, I guess because it was contagious, because of a contagious disease. That's what they said. And so he was actually buried in Hollywood Cemetery, which is a very well-known cemetery here in Richmond. And it has a lot of Confederate generals. So it's really interesting that there's just this huge, this is his memorial, but this huge Japanese grave here in Hollywood Cemetery. And you can see it right here. So some of you might be thinking, like, how do you even find Japanese immigrants here in Virginia? And the answer is the most wonderful resource of all time, the census. Really, really grateful for the census. And I want to pull a plug for April 1st was, I'm sure you guys know this, but 1950 census is now shared, which means that I'm probably going to find like even more stuff that I never even knew because I couldn't access that before. And those are a lot of the dates that I'm looking at. But one of the things I did do was I like spent lots and lots and lots and lots of time combing the censuses and trying to find immigrants that were from Japan. And so this is just like a pullout like that I kind of did from when I did that work. But basically, this is from the 1910 census, and you can see a few different people that were from Japan in this 1910 census. And it's really interesting too, thinking through like, what was their written race? So we see JA, we see JP, we see W for white for some of these folks. We see W crossed out with JP for some of these folks. So, you know, just like the unsureness of where Asian Americans and Japanese Americans in particular, like belonged in society, even like the census takers didn't know. They just kind of did it by what they saw or what they knew. And so I also want to bring your attention to, oh yeah, Larry, that's a great question. So sometimes the census did use Japanese as race. And so there's like a lot of, there's no like one term that was used. So sometimes it would just be written out, yeah, as Japanese, JAP, which is an ethnic slur, W, JP, like all different renditions of that. And I also want to bring your attention to Arthur Tada, because I'm going to bring him up a couple more times throughout this talk. But Arthur Tada and his wife were Mary were listed as residents in Norfolk, Virginia in 1910. And then the thing about Asian American immigrants or Asian immigrants and especially Japanese immigrants is that their names are almost never the same through each census. So oftentimes like people's names would be spelled wrong in a number of ways. And so we see Arthur Tada in 1910, and then I see him again in the 1930 census as Arthur Tade in Norfolk. Basically based on all of the same things we see, it's probably him. And then in 1940, he's Arthur Tada, Tada, so another different spelling. And then actually in a 1941 Virginian Pilot article, he's referred to as Wataru Tada. So, you know, again, like there's these connections that you make and you look at all their details and you're like, okay, this is most likely the same person. But a lot of times, like these are not the same names that you will find over and over in the census. And so what's interesting about Arthur too is, and again, I'm going to bring him up a couple times, so just keep him in the back of your mind, is that it does say that he has a daughter and a son in the census, Alma and Arthur. And he was reported to have operated a restaurant in Church Street in Norfolk and lived in Norfolk since 1908. So he was a long-standing citizen of Virginia. And just as I mentioned, so the census is such an important record. And a lot of times you'll see this. So like you see the scribble here, and you can almost see the W, you can almost make out the W for his race, and then scribbled to JP. And you see that a lot actually. And especially now that we know, so there was decades of denials, but government records do confirm now that the US Census Bureau provided the Secret Service with the names and addresses of Japanese Americans during World War II. So we do know that now. It's like a more recent kind of thing in the past couple of years. But it does make me wonder too, like I'm not entirely sure about this, but if people went back to the census and then crossed out that W, or if that was just done at the same time, it's hard to know. So remember I mentioned Arthur Tada. It's a really interesting article in the Richmond Planet. And I will mention the Richmond Planet is an incredible resource. I'll bring it up again in a second because it's a really cool newspaper. But there's this little article here that talks about Arthur Tara. So again, you see like that many different names here, who is a Japanese who stated he was a merchant residing in Norfolk, applied for a license in Baltimore, Maryland to marry a Miss Mary Wiley, an American girl, which in this context probably means 100% means a white woman, whose residence was also given in Norfolk. Now, can I unmute you guys, or can you guys unmute yourselves? I'm just curious. So why
can unmute, yeah.
Okay, cool. So why would he need to go to Baltimore to marry a white woman, do you think?
Was this pre-loving?
Exactly, 100%. So this is really interesting when we think about like Jim Crow and if Asian Americans and Asian immigrants could marry, right? Could they intermarry? And I'm going to come back to this as well, but Arthur was like, probably not. So he went to Baltimore to do this. Also keep in mind, so now we know he had a daughter and a son, right? Who would have been half Japanese. So also keep that in the back of your mind. This is another example of the census. And I'm going to bring up the person that's highlighted here. I think this is his. Let me just double check. It can be really hard to read. And I'm sure if you guys ever look at it, or I'm sure many of you have looked at the census, your eyes start doing this thing later that you're like, maybe I should step away from this for a little while. But you can see Japanese. So Larry, to your question earlier, you see that in this census here in 1930. And I think that was, I guess I'll come back to this actually. But this is just like an example of how some of these logbooks would look. Now, one of the things I absolutely want to bring up is I mentioned the Richmond Planet earlier. And the Richmond Planet was actually a newspaper that was born in 1882, so it's pretty old. And it was actually founded by 13 formerly enslaved Richmonders. And it was typically, like most of the time, run under this amazing editor called John Mitchell Jr. And he's a character in his own right. So if you're ever interested, he's a really interesting person. Mitchell did a lot for talking about lynching. He was very outspoken. The Richmond Planet was really outspoken against social issues. And he had lots of death threats against him for writing like a lot of these things in the newspaper. It was Black run, Black owned, and he yeah, I can like go on and on, but definitely like take a look at John Mitchell Jr. because he's a really interesting person. So the Richmond Planet did cover local, national, and international news, called attention to segregation, called attention to KKK, voting rights, lynching in Virginia. And this right here, this is a really interesting little snippet of John Mitchell Jr. talking about the Japanese question. And so Larry, to your point earlier, when you talked about Ozawa, there was a huge court case that came out that called Ozawa versus the United States. And basically that was where Ozawa challenged the United States ban on naturalized citizenship for Japanese immigrants, because basically we go back to that naturalization law, we go back to Japanese people, and a lot of other Asians could not become naturalized citizens. And so he challenged this, Ozawa challenged this, and basically argued that race was a matter of color and culture, and, quote, claimed his skin was whiter than that of an average Italian, Spaniard, or Portuguese, and that he was thoroughly assimilated and a fervently patriotic American. Now, I'm not going to go deeply into like colorism or critical race theory here because there's a lot to unpack here for that. But basically, all in all, the court found that Ozawa was every way qualified under the statute to be an American citizen, except for his race. And so they basically said, no, in 1922, this was what year that was. They basically said, no, you can't become a naturalized citizen. Japanese people can't be naturalized citizens because the scientific opinion that denied skin color as a criterion of a racial classification and held that white was synonymous with Caucasian. So they basically said Japanese people are not Caucasian. And so that's a really important court case because we see a lot I think you can definitely make connections from this, right, to Japanese American incarceration. And not only that, but this was also a court case that added to a lot of different murky contradictions around decisions of naturalization in general of Asian immigrants and Asian Americans. For example, with Ozawa as a precedent, a Punjabi man, Bhagat Singh Thind, took his case to the Supreme Court in 1923. So he was like, okay, you just said this in this court case, right? So that means that I should be a citizen. And basically, Thind at the time was a naturalized citizen and he had served in the US Armed Forces. And again, I'm not going to like super go into the Thind case, but basically they took away his citizenship and took away citizenships of South Asians as well. So this is something that we're seeing with a lot of Asian immigrants is they cannot be citizens unless you go harken back to Wong Kim, unless they were born here. And even then with Japanese American incarceration, there's a lot of stuff that goes on with that. And so what's so interesting about this little piece right here is in the Richmond Planet, we see that basically this client who was trying to argue, he's talking about Ozawa, has lost sight that he was playing with a loaded dice and arguing his case before a prejudiced jury in this manner. And we see that with the rejection of Ozawa's argument. This is just another from the Virginia News Leader in 1923, and it's just talking about the Thind case as well as the Ozawa case. So again, we do see some interesting conversation, and I don't know how many Virginians were kind of paying attention to this, but there's one that probably was, and his name was Walter Plecker. And so I have to bring him up because his impact on Virginia history is really important. And it's also important to think about how he tried to shape the way race was viewed in Virginia, which will in turn affect the way that Japanese immigrants and Asian immigrants were seen here. But all in all, these cases really show the contradictions within white supremacy and kind of challenge and destabilize these ideas of race and citizenship. And then again, not super going into this here, but just thinking through how whiteness was really determined through performance. I mentioned how Ozawa had said, oh, well, I'm assimilated. And we see that assimilation on trial for a lot of these court cases. And just showing the evidence of whiteness, right, with their religion, with their class orientation. And so even the Japanese immigrants that I mentioned earlier, right, are higher class. We see like diplomats coming from Japan to look at tobacco. We see Sangi, who I told you, the student who's really attached to Christianity. So these pieces are definitely something to keep in mind. And then, as I mentioned, there was probably one man who was keeping a close eye on these larger Supreme Court cases, and that was Walter Plecker. Has anyone ever heard of who this guy was before? Okay, cool. I see a couple of nods. He's a character. So the same year as the Immigration Act in 1924, so the Immigration Act, often referred to as the National Origins Act, was established, which created a permanent national origins quota system and set an annual immigration quota from each foreign country. And a lot of the countries from Asia were severely limited. So we're thinking about that piece. At the same time, in Virginia, we've got the Racial Integrity Act. And basically this guy, Walter Plecker, who was a physician and the first Virginia state registrar of vital statistics, he was a huge promoter of eugenics, and he very much tried to justify the marginalization of non-white people. And what he did was he created this act to preserve racial integrity, which is what we see here in 1924, which effectively separated Virginia citizens into two simplified racial categories, white and colored. So you can imagine like anyone that like fell in between this, like where does that leave them, right? Where does that leave Asian immigrants? Where does that leave Virginia Indians? And basically that also meant that he criminalized, like permanently made sure, like very loudly criminalized marriages between whites and non-whites. And basically what happened with Virginia Indians is paper genocide, where they were then classified as colored people. But Plecker also pressured state agencies into reclassifying, all state agencies to reclassifying them as colored and trying to erase Indian as an identity, which has made it very difficult to this day for Virginia Indians to gain state and federal recognition. And basically, there's a lot of laws with this that required the separation of whites and colored people at public halls. That was the Massenburg Bill, especially at schools. And so we actually even see that with Asians, is like, where do Asian immigrants fall under this? Like, if there's a Massenburg Bill, that means that colored and white people need to be separate. Where do Asians go? And actually, there were a couple instances where there were the Richmond Ministerial Union who argued that white colleges would have to provide separate seating for Chinese and Japanese students, because as I mentioned, there were a few students here. So it was just a really complex, like complicated situation, right? And there's such small numbers of Asian students and Asian immigrants here that it's just very hard to figure out what to do with them. But at the same time, like I said, there were students. Right here is Arthur Matsu, which there actually was just a lot of stuff for him at William and Mary. William and Mary's been doing a lot of dedications and history stuff on him. But he was a student at William and Mary very early, when William and Mary would have been closed to Black students. So even though we know that there were people arguing like, oh, well, there needs to be some separate seating for Chinese and Japanese students, like could Asian Americans and Asian immigrants marry white people? Well, we see that they kind of can't. But then we also see them at schools that were closed to Black students. So it's this really strange space, right? And it's really complicated. And basically, there's this really great scholar called Leslie Bowe who talks about this being like kind of an interstitial space that Asians kind of exist within. And we see that too. This is a really interesting story that I don't have time to go into, but I will definitely send you guys the link for this. But there was, for example, a Chinese American student who was at John Marshall High School, which is a school in Richmond that was closed to Black students. And he was the only Asian student there. And part of that is because his family was very well known. They were like kind of community leaders. They were friends with the mayor. You see the mayor greeting him in this photo. So again, we think about that class piece as well. But one of the things that I think it was Leslie Bowe who said, like, all of this can be a sign of like discrimination's unevenness and its contingencies. And as such, it just delivers partial knowledge. So it's hard to really know, but there are definitely, I go into like a number of microaggressions that have history here. I'm going to come back to Brenda. I love that question. I'm going to come back to that couple, to Arthur Tada. So don't let me forget. So all of that to build a lot of context around this like really complicated narrative, right? Like we see a lot of unevenness. We see Asians maybe being at schools that were only for white students, but we also see Asians not being able to marry white people. So it's like very, very weird. And a lot of it has to do, I think, I personally think, with like the community they were around, like, and the friends that they made and how long they've been part of the community. But then at the same time, when you see something like the bombings of Pearl Harbor, that changes immediately. And again, it kind of shows you like how quick like things can change when these people at the end of the day were not white. Like we're not white by Supreme Court standards either. And so on Monday, December 8th, 1941, immediately after Pearl Harbor, Virginian Pilot reported that 14 residents of Norfolk were taken into custody. And this was a lightning-like speed, in quotes, because the captain, Ted Miller, police captain, had, under his personal directions several months prior to this, had already interviewed, fingerprinted, and got all the information of the Japanese immigrants that were living in Norfolk. And some of that probably aligned with the Alien Registration Program. And that was enacted in July 1940 in response to the threat of war, which was, it was known as the Smith Act, which required every alien resident living in the United States to register at the local post office. And aliens entering the United States had to register as they applied for admission. It was a very, I think it was like a 2-page form, and it was forwarded to the Immigration and Naturalization Services. And around 93,000 Japanese registered under the alien registration law prior to this. So again, this captain probably was like, you guys really need to do this. And then the minute that Pearl Harbor happened, he gathered them all very quickly because he already had this information. And also this article implied that he had a personal hand in these Norfolk Japanese residents registrations because they arrested them that night, which is kind of wild. And so one of the stories that's so important about Virginia history is not actually my story to tell. It is Regina Boone's. And she's a photojournalist here in Richmond for the Richmond Free Press, which was a newspaper that her father had started. It's a Black-owned, Black-run newspaper. And her grandfather was a Japanese American or a Japanese immigrant living in Norfolk. And he was one of the men from Norfolk that was taken. And I really highly encourage you all to watch the documentary. It's really powerful, really, really moving. And I do a lot of talks with Regina. I have another talk, I'll link it at the end. I have a talk coming up with her in a couple of weeks actually about this. But basically she found out at her father's deathbed that he wanted her to do more research about her grandfather and his father. And some of the things she talks about is like his Tsuruju Miyazaki was his name, his journey. He never officially married her grandmother, who was Black. And so Tsuruju was living in the Black community in Norfolk at the time. So there's also a lot of intersectionality in the stories of Japanese Americans and Asian Americans here in Virginia, because you are thinking about like, where were people, like, where were they supposed to be in this landscape that Walter Plecker had really developed? So I, again, like not going super deeply into her story because it is her story to tell, but absolutely check that film out. She's done a lot of research on her family. And so her grandfather's not in this photo, unfortunately, but he was one of the men that was taken into custody. And these are 11 of 14 Japanese men from Norfolk that were taken right after the bombing. And in this article from Virginia Pilot, it actually had a quote from Wataru Tada, who we had mentioned earlier, Arthur Tada, who was asked what he thought of the day. And he replied, "It's all a mess." The Virginia Pilot said that he seemed very concerned over his situation and solemn when he considered the possibility that he might have to spend the duration of the war in an internment camp. With the exception of 2 of the Japanese in this photo, all arrested in Norfolk at the time had been residents for at least 15 years, and several of them had lived for 35 years or more in Norfolk. The article identified a number of the men, and additionally, all of them knew each other. So even though it wasn't a large community, they definitely had their own small community. And many of them have been long acquainted. And then the Virginia Pilot also reported that like the Norfolk, Portsmouth, Newport News area, they said that there were about 40 Japanese immigrants there. Now, I haven't been able to track down 40 because that's a lot more than what I've found, but that was what they had reported. And they said that everyone was seized within a couple of days. And so it also specified in the article that there were other natives of Japan in this area who had become American citizens, which is really interesting because the article specifically said that these folks will not be affected by the confiscation order, nor will they be taken into custody, which is really interesting because we see on the West Coast that there were folks that basically said, like, if people have one drop of Japanese blood, they need to be incarcerated. Especially in California, I think it was like 1/16 Japanese blood people like were sent to camps. But we see here, and we know, right? We know Alma and Arthur, Alma, I think it was his son's name. We know Arthur Tada's son and daughter were half Japanese, right? But they're not in this photo, but Arthur is, which is really interesting when you think about that. So the people that were taken immediately, it looks like were first gen, like Japanese immigrants themselves, men, which again, like very different from the West Coast where everyone was taken. We also see people in DC that were taken. There were a couple residents, like a well-known Japanese newspaper writer and resident of DC. There were a couple other folks just like there that were also taken. And it's really hard to gauge the atmosphere of other areas in Virginia because there's so few resources about them. There's one historian that highlighted a frenzied air in Richmond, where the city had an enemy hunt after the attack on Pearl Harbor. And police were told by an excited taxi driver he had taken some Japanese fares to a Fulton address, and the police with sirens shrieking descended on the address, but to police disappointment, the passengers were Seminole Indians. So that was like one thing that's going on. So everything, you know, we had Japanese students, we have Japanese diplomats, we have Japanese educators coming in, and then on a dime, right? Like the minute Pearl Harbor happens, we have this frenzied air, we have people arrested. So it's always important to kind of remember how quickly things could change. This is another photo of a naval shore patrolman blocking the doorways to the rooms which Japanese people were held. And the article mentioned that they worked until 9 o'clock fingerprinting and photographing the 14 men, and they were actually transported later to the city jail. It's really interesting too, because even though a lot of folks were sent away from Virginia, it seems like there were at least a few, like 4 Japanese Americans from the West Coast relocated to Richmond. But again, I'm having a hard time like tracking down exactly what happened to them after. And the Richmond Times-Dispatch did report that in Roanoke, they had said like German, Italian, and Japanese nationals have a federal order to surrender radio transmitters, shortwave radio receiving sets, and cameras, which it's hard to tell. Like it could imply that maybe there were Japanese people in that area, but I just don't know for a fact. This picture is Hidemitsu Toyota, which I'm doing more research on him. He was one of the people who was sent away from here in Norfolk to the Rower camp. So there are 2 camps in Arkansas, Rower and Jerome, and those are the only 2 in the South. A lot of times people think of camps as being like in Wyoming or like Heart Mountain, but the 2 camps in the South in Arkansas, I've actually been to them. That was where George Takei was sent to one of them. And so these men, at least 3 of the men from Norfolk were sent to the camps in Arkansas. And Hidemitsu Toyota is really interesting because I'm pretty sure he's the same Hidemitsu Toyota that later put a court case against the Supreme Court arguing for his certificate of naturalization, which is, it's again, like much more research needs to be done on him. But if he is the same person, which I'm pretty sure he is, he also was in the United States Coast Guard service. He was 53, and supposedly in this article for the Virginian Pilot, they said that his activities had interested Norfolk police for several months. They said, quiet, reflective, Toyota's been in this country for 33 years, has lived in Norfolk for the past 16. When asked about his reactions to the bombing of Pearl Harbor, he said, I thought there would be more of negotiations. He speaks English well and Japanese fluently. This is one of Regina's photos of some of the men here in Norfolk that were taken. And you can see like this guy, he was probably like in the middle of cooking, or in the middle, like people were just taken, like, you know, while they were probably in the middle of doing things, while they're in the middle of work, very quickly. So remember Arthur Tada. He's just always coming back into this story. What's really interesting about Arthur is that he's mentioned here as Wataru Tada, who operates a restaurant in Church Street, raised his family in Norfolk, lived here since 1906. His daughter Alma obtained an attorney for him, which again is really interesting because we know she would have been half Japanese. And in the West Coast, she would have also been sent to the camps. But here she's trying to get an attorney for her father. He was sent to a camp, so unfortunately it did not work out that way. But he was actually ended up eventually finding his way back somehow. I need to do more research on his story, to Virginia, and this is his grave at Forest Lawn Cemetery in Norfolk. He did pass away in 1967. So remember I mentioned earlier too that Japanese diplomats would often come to Hot Springs, and what actually happened during World War II after the bombing of Pearl Harbor is all of the Japanese diplomats in DC were sent to Homestead. They were actually there for, I think it was like 4 months. And basically there were a number of articles that talk about them being under, even though they were there and they were diplomats, so they brought all of everything they had from the embassy in DC, but they were brought by a special train. This is what one article said. And they were basically, when they came, the homestead was given reportedly no advance notice of their arrival, and a huge crowd came to watch them come in. But basically what happened is, even though they were at this nice luxury resort, the homestead was closed to the public, and the FBI basically took over and closed all the entrances with barricades and put up sentry boxes. So like, even though, yeah, like it's a luxury resort, they still had sentry boxes, they still had guards around them, making sure they didn't leave. And all the employees and others who interacted with them had to be identified by pass cards with photographs and fingerprints. There's actually a huge spread in a Life magazine in 1942 on their time in the homestead. And it's a lot of really, really racist articles that talk about, like, I can't believe that they're here, you know, like, I can't believe they're like living this luxury life in the homestead. And they weren't there that long. I think, like I said, I think it was like 4 months, and they were actually taken from here to White Sulphur Springs, which is really interesting. But it's, again, we see that dichotomy of, like, before Pearl Harbor, we had ambassadors here as guests with their children, like playing in the pools, and now, like right after Pearl Harbor, they are surrounded by sentries and by guards. There's some really interesting stories too of students that were in Virginia during the time of the camps. There's this one man in Richmond, Henry Mack, who basically like felt like this was a really unfair thing that after FDR put all the Japanese Americans in camps, and so he felt like he had to do something, and basically got this one woman out of the camp and brought her to Richmond and lived with his family. Her name is Kai Kaneda. This is her right here. And it's just like a very interesting story. And like he would like bring her around Richmond to like show that she wasn't dangerous, and that like Japanese people weren't dangerous, which, you know, I'm not going to unpack all of this now, but it's just a very interesting story of Kai being here. And there were also some other students that even during this time were not taken to the camps, like on the right, Father Nakajo, who was a graduate student at Episcopal Seminary in Alexandria. But again, we see this connection with Father Nakajo with Christianity, and that whiteness on display in some ways. And perhaps most interesting to me is some of the experiences of Japanese American soldiers who came through Virginia. And so I'm sure you guys have kind of learned a little bit about the 442nd Infantry Regiment, which was the regiment best, it's actually one of the most decorated regiments in the US military history, but it was composed almost entirely of second gen American soldiers of Japanese ancestry. So Nisei is the word, who fought in World War II. And basically, there are these really interesting interviews of folks who were in the 442nd who came through Camp Lee and who came through Virginia and like would take a train through Alexandria. And this is a picture of Hideo Hoshide, and this interview is on Densho. And he talks about his first arrival to DC when he knew the bus was segregated and he didn't know where to sit, which is really interesting thinking about these folks coming through here. So he thought that, quote, in between, I thought it would be a safe place. And he didn't have any problem on that particular bus ride, but had to change buses in Alexandria, where he again had the same question. And he said there was a white woman, he was asking the driver where to sit. And he said a white woman overheard him and basically said that, well, like you're a white, you can just sit in the white section. And he responded like he was of yellow race. And so this woman was just like, well, I mean, you should just sit in the white section. And so basically, just like the census takers, just like we see in all this past history, is like this real unsurety of like where to be, but it is still determined by white people. And so basically his interaction, he mentions like, I didn't know how I should act, like whether I'm black or a white. And we see similar situations with another soldier who was on leave at Camp Lee, who like wasn't sure where to go and he was allowed to be. And there's quite a few accounts where we see them kind of classified as white. But again, this like unsurety of like, I'm not really sure where I should go. There's one account in particular, Thomas Heiga remembers that he was surprised at the invisible wall that existed between blacks and whites. I learned about it traveling in the South. On buses, the front seats were reserved for whites and the rear seats for blacks. Since I was neither white nor black, I could sit anywhere. When there was a seat in the white section, I sat there, no one complained. But again, we think about like who was around, right? Like he was probably wearing his uniform, which probably does mean something. On top of the fact that like, you know, I think if Walter Plecker had been sitting there, I don't think he would have let that fly. So it's really dependent on like people in power and like people in community and how they were determining that. And to go back to that question of what happened to that couple who's married in Baltimore. So they did return to Norfolk, but just they didn't get married in Virginia. And we actually see this is a court case that is not about Japanese immigrants, but it is about an Asian American man marrying a white woman. And basically, this was 11 years before Loving versus Virginia, 9v9. And there was a Chinese sailor and a white woman who traveled from their home in Norfolk to North Carolina to get married. So similar to like Arthur getting married in Baltimore. And that was to evade Virginia's miscegenation laws. 1 year later, this was kind of a messy case, which is why it's not talked about a lot. 1 year later, Ruby 9 wanted a divorce. The white woman wanted a divorce. And she said that, well, it should be an annulment because it never should have been a marriage to begin with because of the miscegenation laws. And so the trial court and the Virginia Supreme Court of Appeals said, you're right. And they annulled the marriage. And it never actually went to the Supreme Court, but we already see that, like, even though it's like a very complicated way of saying, like, you're right, Asians cannot marry white people. So again, we see like, we don't know how much, you know, how like the communities that knew if people were married or not, like we see with Regina's story, like her grandfather never officially got married to her grandmother. You know, so just some food for thought. And again, I hearken back to Leslie Bow's quote of treatment of non-Black, non-white people confirm the flexibility and resourcefulness of white supremacy's apparatus. And we see that throughout. This is a really complicated story. It's a really complicated narrative. When I first started doing this research, I thought it would be much more clear cut. But as you see with each person, with each story, it's like very murky. And it's really dependent on like their communities and the people they're around. Oh, and this is just like a quick thing to throw out that like a lot of the stories that I'm talking about too are, and I found a lot of things in the census, in newspapers, is people writing about them. Like we don't really get to hear from the voices of these Asian immigrants and Asian Americans, although we do have Hideo's interview, but that's much later, that's in the 40s. So just a reminder too of like when you're looking at sources and when you're thinking about it, like who is writing it and what are they saying. And I do like a really deep dive of one person who had like really clearly had like good intentions, but like there's a lot of like deeper microaggression history there and like why that's there. So like always questioning like what your resources are. And yeah, this is just like kind of an additional, 2021 was the 42nd federal and 19th Virginia observance of Asian American Pacific Islander Heritage Month, which is coming up here in May. We do celebrate, Virginia celebrates, it's one of the few states, or I think it was one of the first states to celebrate Fred Korematsu Day, which Fred Korematsu was someone who he was put into a camp and pushed against the camp's legality. And yeah, this is just, again, like good to know because May is coming up. And it was originally chosen to include the date of the first Japanese immigrants to the United States and the completion of the transcontinental railroads. And there's like more like nuts and bolts history of like federal observance if you're interested in learning more about that. And then hopefully I kept the time. Oh my God, I talk so much. I'm so sorry, guys. So I want to like definitely open up for discussion and for questions and thoughts. Like I'm really interested to hear if many of you had ever heard of some of this before or if this was all new. And you guys can always reach out to me. Like these are both my emails. I check them both all the time. Also have a book Instagram, a bookstagram at Booked with Emma. So I have a lot of like book recommendations. And then I will send you guys this in the chat too. But like, there's also just, I was talking about a lot of links. So like, there's a lot of links here. And I forgot to mention terminology as you guys hear me talk about incarceration versus internment. And part of that is the language, which I really encourage you all to check out this terminology link. I have created a pretty comprehensive bibliography for the Library of Virginia, as well as a web page that's linked here. And then I also have some other book suggestions that are both fiction and nonfiction. There's been some really, really good books, like fiction books that have come out. I know you guys were reading George Takei's They Call Us Enemy. Displacement is another fantastic graphic novel that came out last year. And We Are Not Free. I just actually had a speaking engagement with Tracy Chi this month. I don't even know what day it is. And then like Clark and Division, which actually is a mystery, like a murder mystery fictional book. So there's a lot of different ways you can kind of think about incarceration. Clark and Division is really interesting too, because it's Chicago based. And a lot of people think about, again, like a lot of people think about the camps as only being West Coast phenomenon, but it was not. So I'll go ahead and drop this in the link and just open it up to you guys.
All right, and you guys can unmute. I have given you that ability, so it's totally up to you if you want to unmute or if you want to send a direct message to Emma or myself, you can do either.
I'm just interested, have you guys ever heard of this before? Kind of like heard of this history as being Virginia?
No.
Me neither, no.
Yeah, I think for a lot of us, it was probably news. I don't know. Larry, did you already know some of this? You're usually pretty up on things, so.
So all the Virginia history was due to me. You know, what you talked about, or what you shared from Richmond and Norfolk.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And is that where, I'm sorry, Emma, is that where most of the, Japanese American population was living? Was it in that kind of like coastal capital area?
Yeah, Norfolk was like the largest community, and by large, it was still like pretty small, but there were definitely like individuals living in really rural areas too. And again, like even if we think about like Randolph-Macon, but also like Harrisonburg, I think there was someone. So it's like just individual people kind of spread out.
It seemed, the link you sent is for,
Oh, I meant to send that to everyone. Thank you, Larry.
it's a different link.
And I just saw your question about, do you mind if I repeat it, Larry? Or do you
Yeah,
want to repeat it?
No, that's fine. If you want to
Sure.
read it.
Larry, you had some really great thoughts and questions throughout the program, so thank you for that. So you mentioned these historic uncertainties about official identity and deference to white perspective or white supremacy. Do you feel like that contributes to today's ongoing microaggressions, like where are you from and who are you? And absolutely, I think we see a lot of that when we think about the way that race was defined, especially towards Asians in this country, like officially, right? Like officially, Japanese people were not white. And on top of that, in Virginia specifically, where we have a society that divided people very specifically into two categories. So like, where does everyone else kind of fall into? And I think that's why I went back so far. And I apologize, I started so early, but some of that is because you can start to see all of the connections of like how this happened so easily, and like how like thinking about like that from a Virginia perspective is very different in some ways than thinking of it from a California perspective.
Do you know if many, if for people who did get sent out of state, like to Arkansas, do you know much about people who came back to Virginia? I know you had mentioned, I think Arthur did, but
Yeah.
I don't know if that was pretty common or if they were kind of like, no, thank you.
Yeah, well, Regina does talk a little bit about that with her own story and like her grandfather going to Chicago and not coming back. But some of that is all going to be really new research with the 1950 census coming out. I wasn't able to tell a lot of that with the census, but now with this, I think I'll be able to see like if there were people that came back. What's most interesting to me is the people that became citizens after being incarcerated, because like, so for example, my great great grandmother was incarcerated from LA, not from Richmond, but from LA or like California area. And she decided to become a citizen after everything, after incarceration. And I mentioned that with Hidemitsu too, which I think is so fascinating because it's like they were put into these camps and still wanted to become American citizens. So sorry, that was a very long way of saying like I'm not sure like how many people came back, but I know that at least there was at least one person, because I went to the pilgrimage to Arkansas pre-pandemic, and there was a woman who was living in Harrisonburg, pretty elderly, who had been living in Virginia, I think, since like after she had been incarcerated. But again, like these stories can be really hard to find, and a lot of these folks are passing away now, so it's even harder.
Kind of wonder where they would go back to, if not where they were living, in a sense, because the whole country had that attitude, I guess.
Absolutely.
I don't know. I don't know what happened in the middle part of the country. I'm from the West Coast, so I know that was huge up there. I read another fictional account of this recently that I thought was good. I don't know. Have you read The Hotel on the Corner of Bitter and Sweet?
No, I'll have to check that one out.
Yeah, that was good. I don't remember the author, but it was about the time period and what happened to the families that were sent to internment camps.
That's great. Thank you for that, Brenda.
Yeah, I'm gonna look at yours too.
Yeah. Well, and I didn't even go into like, you know, 60s, like oh God, I'm totally forgetting the word. Like when the United States for like reparations. I didn't even go into reparations, which is in its own really interesting. And there's like a lot of studies and good information there. And also not to mention, it wasn't, as I say, like it wasn't just West Coast folks affected. There were also people from Canada of Japanese ancestry and Latin America. So like Peru and Brazil that were sent to the camps in the United States. And so, yeah, so that story is also like really interesting. And like, they did not receive reparations. The only people that got reparations for this were those who had been American citizens. So again, like it could connect with that question of like maybe some people did become American citizens to get the reparations check, but I'm not completely sure. And there's a lot of folks that won't talk about reparations. Like I had a great uncle who was incarcerated who said he refused to take the reparations. And like there was a lot of shame there in the community about like talking about this because they just wanted to move on with their lives. So just a whole other aspect that is just, I think, really interesting.
Emma, were you able to find information about the families from Virginia that were incarcerated, if they were able to return or if they lost their properties and, you know, resources, much like the people out west?
Yeah, absolutely. And that's a great question, Larry. And Regina does talk a little bit about, so her grandfather owned a restaurant, and that restaurant is gone now, which is really sad. And so she does kind of talk about that in her documentary as well. But it's hard to find because there were so few Japanese people here, but they probably most assuredly lost whatever they may have had. And again, like that might be stuff I can maybe suss out with the 1950 census. It's kind of incredible. Like the 1950 census is like feels like a key that I'm like, oh my God, like what can I find? Like and you know, like I said, like maybe we'll see Arthur Tada in there under a completely different name. Like I'm not sure. That's a great question though.
Right. Does anybody else have any questions? We did really well on time. You shouldn't have stressed so much about getting it done on time.
And thank you guys. I'm so sorry. It's a lot of history. It's a lot of things to think about. So like definitely feel free to like, if you ruminate on anything and have questions later too, like always feel free to reach out to me.
Yeah. And would you be okay with if I emailed you later getting like a copy of the slides with all the photos and everything?
Sure, absolutely. I have a lot of links in there too. So definitely happy to send that along. And I also meant to mention too, Virginia Humanities has a great resource called Encyclopedia Virginia, and it has all these encyclopedic entries of a lot of different things. And I'm working on one right now on this. So hopefully that will be up soon as well.
Awesome. That's great.
Thank you so much.
Yeah, thank
Yeah,
you so
thank
much.
you.
Yeah, really good.